So, welcome all humanists, atheists, freethinkers, and other skeptics and critical thinkers, and happy Darwin Day. This holiday is one of our special secular holidays celebrated around the world and at many universities and scientific organizations, and is our way of celebrating science on the week of Darwin Day, the celebration of the birth of Charles Darwin. It is a major humanist and secular community holiday celebrating, quote, the principles of intellectual bravery, perpetual curiosity, scientific thinking, and hunger for truth as embodied in Charles Darwin. The American Humanist Association even runs the worldwide clearinghouse of activities at darwinday.org. At this point, I want to make a land acknowledgement. We here in Boston acknowledge that the land where we work, live, learn, and build community has been a place where people have lived for over 15,000 years. This land is the territory of the Massachusetts, Pawtucket, and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc peoples. We wish to respect the continued connections with past, present, and future in our ongoing relationships with Indigenous and other peoples in the Boston community.
And you want to just do it right on the laptop without the TV?
Could we,
Okay, let's do that then.
Mute, please.
Oh, it's giving you the launch meeting.
Mute, please.
No, but
okay, I did that. Sorry about that. And back to our introduction. So, so we would like to invite all to get involved in anti-colonialist and indigenous land struggles wherever you live. There are some links in the chat for getting involved. I will be posting those momentarily. Most of you are no strangers to humanism and what it stands for. We are good without gods. Check out the chat area of this Zoom meeting for some basics on our group and other secular group links in the area. A couple of quick announcements before we start. On Tuesday, February 15th, that's this Tuesday, from 7 to 8, the Humanist Chaplaincy at Harvard and MIT will have their monthly secular mindfulness meditation led by Rick Heller, and that will take place on Zoom. You can find that as well as other information about activities in our area and beyond on our website, bostonhumanists.org. On Thursday, February 24, which is a little over a week and a half away, AHSA, the American Humanist Association's Speakers Series, will present the Zoom talk, The Minds of Animals, with Mark Reimers, a neuroscientist at Michigan State, who gave a version of this fascinating talk before the Concord area humanists last year. Our speaker today is well known to many of us in the Boston humanist community. Dr. Abby Hafer is a speaker, writer, and humorist who particularly loves taking on intelligent design, creationism, the idea of a rigid gender binary, the politics surrounding these subjects, and science denialism in general. She has written a book titled The Not So Intelligent Designer: Why Evolution Explains the Human Body and Intelligent Design Does Not, which was published in 2015. She has a doctorate in zoology from Oxford University and teaches human anatomy and physiology right in New England here at Curry College. She also serves on the board of the American Humanist Association. Dr. Hafer is also the co-author of Bill H-471, a bill in the Massachusetts legislature which requires that all science taught in public schools be based on peer-reviewed science. She hopes that someday reality-based public science education will be thus protected all over the country. She's also the author, with David Renstein, of the recent book, Darwin's Apostles, about which she will speak today. Welcome, Abby.
I'm glad to be here. Now we're going to be doing this talk is based on some of the material in my book, Darwin's Apostles. And Stuart has the unenviable task of advancing the slides for me. This is the first time we've done this. Technology has changed in some way that is inexplicable to us. So bear with us while we try this. But I'm ready to get going with the talk if Stuart would like to share the slide screen. Okay, so can everyone see the slide? Can I just get a nod from, okay, great, thank you. Then I will get started and we will see how this goes. So on October 3rd, 2019, Boston Globe columnist Scott Lehigh was horrified that former President Trump made up stories and then presented them as facts. He lamented, "It's all rot, preposterous allegations, groundless assertions, and conspiracy theories." He wanted to know, next slide, please. Pre-Trump, who would have imagined an American president who could establish a bizarre evidence-free counter-narrative that would gull or at least sow doubts in a substantial portion of the electorate? My answer, next slide, please. Every evolutionary biologist and climate scientist alive. That's who. The Globe published my response. So for those of you who are concerned about big lies, fake news, and alternative facts, as an evolutionary biologist, allow me to say, next slide, please. Welcome to my world. We've been dealing with this for my entire career. I'm not exaggerating. Here's some of my evidence. Next slide, please. As a presidential candidate in 1980, Ronald Reagan said he believed that public schools ought to be allowed to teach the biblical theory of creation in tandem with evolution. He also asserted that recent discoveries, which he did not specify, lent credence to the creationist position. So it's all there 40 years ago. An American president who went along with a bizarre evidence-free counter-narrative that gulled or at least sowed doubts in a substantial portion of the population. Denial of evolution has been going on at high levels of government, both state and nationally, for over 40 years. Again, next slide, please. Welcome to my world. There is a direct line from denying evolution to denying climate change, to denying scientific facts in general, to denying that facts of any kind exist. It has gotten so bad that this sign appeared at the Marches for Science in both Boston and Washington. Next slide, please. Now, let's take a closer look at that. Next slide. Objective reality exists. We have gotten to the point where we have to assert that. So for those of you who are alarmed by fake news, let me say this as a biologist again. Next slide, please. Welcome to my world. I'm glad you're here. And thank you for taking an interest in this problem. Welcome as well to the world of Darwin's Apostles, the scientists who clubbed together around Charles Darwin to get evolution accepted. They had to go up against powerful entrenched interests who would have been glad to crush them. And all they had going for them was reality and a willingness to stand up for it. And despite the way that it sometimes seems, they largely succeeded. Their goal was to convince the scientific communities in England, Europe, and the US to accept evolution, and to convince the general public in England and the US as well. They only failed in convincing the entire population of the United States. But it was a long, hard campaign. So what can we learn from them? First, it was a campaign. The phrase public relations had not yet been invented, but that's what they were doing. They allowed Darwin to have the role of the gentle genius who was above the fray. Then they went to bat for evolution in the public sphere. Each of them did slightly different things, sometimes in concert with the others and sometimes not. What did they do? Let's start with this guy, John William Draper. Next slide, please. He was, next slide, An American, though born and educated in England, he was trained in medicine. He was a chemist and polymath. He was the first president of the American Chemical Society. He helped found the NYU Medical School. And he studied the chemistry of light, which included photosynthesis, photography, astrophotography, and how light can be produced by heat. He proposed the electric light bulb more than 30 years before Edison patented it. What can we learn from him about our present day problems? First, do not shrink from discussing the dangers of fundamentalist religion. But second, work with religion when they express an interest. This is what John William Draper did. This is one of his many books. Next slide, please. The history of the conflict between religion and science. He did not hesitate to let you know where he stood. He wrote, next slide, please. The two rival divisions of the Christian Church, Protestant and Catholic, were thus in accord on one point: to tolerate no science except as they considered agreeable to the scriptures. He was not a fan of this attitude towards science. However, he worked with religion when invited to. On October 11th, 1877, he gave a speech to Unitarian ministers in Springfield, Massachusetts, titled Evolution, Its Origin, Progress, and Consequences. He closed it by pleading with the ministers to not reject this all-important theory. It was published in Popular Science Monthly. Next, Alfred Russel Wallace. He is the co-discoverer of evolution along with Darwin. He was an unlikely hero. He was British. He was from a poor family. He was trained in surveying, the only one out of all these guys who didn't study medicine. And as a surveyor, he saw country poverty up close, caused by enclosure laws. He rejected the class system and organized religion early in adulthood. He hoped to make his financial fortune by collecting exotic species, and he hoped to make his scientific name by figuring out how species originate. To these ends, he made a years-long expedition to the Amazon. It ended badly. After he had put nearly all his specimens and scientific notebooks on board a boat to go home, the boat sank. So our first lesson from Wallace is don't give up. After that disaster, he made another expedition, this time to the Malay Archipelago. There, he took notes on how species are distributed. When he got sick and had to stay in bed, he thought about species distributions and figured out evolution by natural selection. He wrote a solid article about it, backed by evidence, and sent it along in a letter to his helpful correspondent, Charles Darwin. This was what finally got Darwin to publish that he had figured out evolution as well. Darwin had figured out evolution years earlier, but had been afraid to publish. Instead, he did endless research, hoping to someday write a multi-volume definitive text on evolution that would be irrefutable. Then he received Wallace's article. Darwin knew that Wallace deserved credit for the discovery, but so did Darwin. And, next slide, please. Thus it was that Wallace inadvertently struck a terror into Charles Darwin that was even greater than Darwin's terror of the backlash that he knew would follow his announcement of his discovery of evolution by natural selection. And that terror was, of course, not getting credit for the discovery. So the discovery of the theory of evolution by natural selection was announced at the next meeting of the Linnaean Scientific Society, and Darwin and Wallace were listed as co-discoverers. And Darwin realized that he had to get off the dime, give up writing the multi-volume treatise, and come out instead with a good, readable, well-researched volume. Next slide, please. And that is how On the Origin of Species finally got written. So although, slide please. So although Wallace did not have a hand in writing Origin, he definitely had a foot in Darwin's backside that made him do it. So what can we learn from this? First, be not afraid. Wallace wrote his essay when he had what he needed. Also, if possible, be a genius who can do groundbreaking work when sick. The next apostle I'm going to talk about is Joseph Hooker. Hooker was, although trained in medicine, he became a world-famous botanist. He was the director of Kew Gardens, which are the Royal Botanic Gardens. He went on expeditions to Antarctica, India and the Himalayas, Palestine, Morocco, and the American West. He did botanical research and brought back specimens from all over the world. He provided vast quantities of botanical evidence for evolution. He was the first scientist to whom Darwin confessed his ideas about evolution, and he was probably Darwin's closest friend. Regarding evolution, he famously said, and I cannot emphasize enough how important this is. Next slide, please. I knew of this theory 15 years ago. I was then entirely opposed to it. I argued against it again and again. But since then, I have devoted myself unremittingly to natural history. In its pursuit, I have traveled round the world. Facts in this science, which before were inexplicable to me, became one by one explained by this theory. And conviction has been thus gradually forced on an unwilling convert. This is a theme that we see repeated constantly. Scientists didn't accept evolution because they wanted to, but because their intellectual integrity demanded that they had to. What can be learned from Hooker? First, be not afraid. On his voyage to the Antarctic, the ships were cheerfully named the Erebus and the Terror. The name Terror does not inspire confidence in me, but Hooker went anyway. During his voyage to the Himalayas, Hooker and his traveling partner were captured and held prisoner. The British government eventually got them out. Second, have intellectual integrity and accept compelling evidence. Third, keep working in your older years. Hooker's botanical expedition to the American West was done when he was 60 years old. He walked up and down the Rocky Mountains gathering evidence for evolution. Another world-famous botanist who helped out tremendously was, next slide please, Asa Gray. Asa Gray was an American. He was trained in medicine, and he was a professor of botany at Harvard. He provided even more botanical evidence for evolution. He oversaw the publication of Origin of Species in the United States, and he successfully defended evolution in numerous debates with the Harvard geologist and zoologist Louis Agassiz. Next slide, please. He also studied the Asa Gray Disjunction, the botanical mystery of why plant communities in New England more closely resemble those in Northern Asia than they do those in the American West. Darwin persuaded Gray about the reality of evolution by corresponding with Gray and pointing out that the disjunction is explained by evolution. This correspondence also provided crucial evidence showing that Darwin had discovered and written about evolution before Wallace's letter arrived. So what can we learn from Gray? First, promote other people's work, as Gray did when he saw to the U.S. publication of Origin of Species. And second, defend other people's work, as Gray did in his debates with Agassiz. And now for a man who has a special place in my heart, the anatomist Thomas Henry Huxley, who wrote the following deathless prose. Next slide, please. Before I have done with that mendacious humbug, I will nail him out like a kite to a barn door, an example to all evildoers. He said this as criticism of a botched dissection. Speaking as an anatomist myself, I want you to know that we anatomists take our dissections seriously. Here's what was going on. Many powerful people did not like the idea of evolution. This included a famous biologist named Richard Owen. Owen was the director of the Natural History Museum in London. Owen claimed that human brains are so fundamentally different from all other brains that humans could not possibly be related to other primates. In fact, he said, we are barely even mammals. As a result, he said evolution could not possibly be true. He wanted to completely reclassify human beings, and he based his reclass on three tiny things. First, the shape of the lobe at the back of the brain. And second, two tiny fluid-filled spaces inside the brain. That's all he had. If those differences seem trivial to you, you're right, they are trivial. And this is the kicker, they don't even exist. So everything that Owen said about these huge differences, not only were they trivial, they were not there anyway. That's why Huxley called Owen a mendacious humbug. Huxley was an anatomist, and he dissected lots of primate brains. He drew pictures of the dissections. He compared one primate brain to another, and he corresponded with other scientists who dissected primate brains. And they all found that what Owen claimed was simply wrong. Huxley wrote about this. He published his results in scientific journals. He wrote letters to newspapers about his results. He spoke about this at public lectures and at scientific meetings. And Owen kept making his same tired claims over and over again. When asked to refute Owen yet again, Huxley got fed up and said publicly, next slide, please, life is too short to occupy oneself with the slaying of the slain more than once. Fortunately, this was the one time that Huxley was lying through his teeth. He hadn't given up. He kept writing. He kept lecturing. He kept researching. And he engaged the social media of his day, newspapers. Next slide, please. There we are. Cities in those days had multiple newspapers that were openly partisan and often had 2 editions a day. They were the new media of that era. People wrote letters to the editor that were as long as articles. They would push a certain viewpoint. Others would write back saying how wrong the first letter writer had been. These slanging matches would go back and forth and would drive circulation. The combating letter writers could become famous. Does this sound familiar? These letters were the Twitter wars of their day. And Thomas Henry Huxley did what most scientists are loath to do. He engaged, really engaged social media. He wrote letters to newspapers, refuted letters in newspapers, wrote articles in newspapers, and book reviews in newspapers and magazines, and otherwise defended and promoted evolution against all naysayers every chance he got. He was willing to mix it up in public and be a showman. And he got a friend of his and fellow anatomist, William Henry Flower, to help. It is not often in the annals of science that a scientist is ambushed at a scientific meeting. But Flower did it, and he did it with style. Here's the story. Even after years of being repeatedly refuted, Owen was still at it, telling his lies in a presentation at a scientific meeting. So William Henry Flower waited until the end of Owen's presentation. And then he stood up and said, slide please. I happen to have in my pocket a monkey's brain. And he did too. And he proceeded to do a dissection right there in real time so that all the world and all the assembled scientists there could see that Owen was wrong. The ongoing conflict between Huxley and Owen got to be funny. British popular culture noticed. Cartoons about it appeared in magazines. Characters in comic plays talked about it. A satirical book was written about it. The British Medical Journal got upset and said, slide please. Is it not high time that the annual passage of barbed words between Professor Owen and Professor Huxley on the cerebral distinction between men and monkeys should cease? Continued on its present footing, it becomes a hindrance and an injury to science, a joke for the populace and a scandal to the scientific world. In other words, stop being so divisive. But Huxley didn't stop, fortunately. So what are the lessons from Huxley so far? First, don't be afraid of showmanship. Second, establish your facts solidly. Third, use social media. And fourth, persist, even at the expense of being called divisive. Huxley was also willing to engage the top of the political and literary scale. He and William Gladstone engaged in a series of printed debates. Gladstone had already been British Prime Minister once and would be again another 3 times. They debated the value of evolutionary biology versus knowledge of the Bible. So Huxley debated the most powerful politician in his country, and he didn't pull any punches. In fact, most say that Huxley ran rings around Gladstone. But regardless of who came out best, the fact is that Huxley engaged one of the most prominent politicians of his era, combated as an equal, and put science and evolution front and center as a force to be reckoned with in the public eye. Huxley also reformed Great Britain. He was a true radical in the etymological sense of the word. Radical means uprooting, as in uprooting what has been done, thought, and accepted, and planting in something else. As an established scientist, Huxley spent hours and years literally reforming British society, doing unglamorous work on committees and commissions. He reformed things from Indian agriculture to Scottish fisheries, and policies on contagious diseases and education, especially education. The curriculum seen in most modern high schools and in liberal arts colleges follows Huxley's ideas about education. Huxley was no mere gadfly. He not only spoke truth to power, he was also willing to put his hands on the levers of power. As he became a well-connected insider, Huxley made a point of using his insider status to change society for the better. So what can we learn? First, don't duck confrontation. Second, speak truth to power, but also third, be willing to do the work of the powerful. And Huxley organized. Huxley wanted to get religion out of science. He wanted science to be a profession. He wanted scientists to have the status and salaries of professionals. And he knew he couldn't make this happen all by himself. So he and Joseph Hooker became founding members of a dining club they called the X Club. They met monthly in London. They believed that science is beneficial as a mental and educational discipline, as well as having practical benefits for society. They claimed on this basis that cultural leadership should go to scientists rather than clergy. They specifically defended evolution by natural selection and Charles Darwin himself. They campaigned for science education at all levels, plus jobs for scientists and government support for science. They largely succeeded. They gained power, advised the government, did vast amounts of educational outreach, and in Huxley's case, wrote biology textbooks and revised the British educational system at all levels so that it would include science education. However, among all these practical signs of success, perhaps the most telling cultural evidence is this. In 1889, the book Lux Mundi was published. Next slide, please. This collection of essays written by clergy in the Church of England assumes that evolution is true. The essays seek to explain and even recast the faith in light of evolutionary theory. So the mighty Church of England gave way to science. The religion that stretched all over the world, courtesy of the British Empire. The religion that had only stopped executing people for heresy after 1612 changed its supposedly timeless truths in order to make way for the real thing. So Darwin's apostles had succeeded. What can we learn? Next slide, please. Organize. So here we are today. Darwin's apostles are long dead. In our current era, fundamentalist religions, moneyed interests, and the politicians who pander to them are breaking down our body politic, the idea that science matters, and even our concept of truth itself. This breakdown has taken place over many decades. To paraphrase Martin Niemöller, first they came for evolutionary biology. But I didn't speak out because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. Next, they came for climate science, but I didn't speak out because climate change is not quite enough of a disaster. Then they came for elections, and people finally started to pay attention. There are those who say that we are engaged in a struggle for the soul of this nation. I say that we are engaged in a struggle for the brain of this nation. But a brain without good values does not accomplish much that is decent. So we are engaged in a struggle for the brain and integrity of this nation. In the Victorian era, Darwin's apostles banded together to assert and defend an unpopular scientific truth. Today's tenacious evolutionary biologists, climate scientists, and epidemiologists are defending
We seem to have lost Abby for a second. Not sure if she's aware of that, but Oh, wait a second here.
She's frozen.
Is she frozen on your screen? She's disappeared from mine. We will, let me see if I can give her a call. She may not be aware that she's no longer broadcasting.
Maybe a climate denial hacker.
Maybe it's a flat earther upset that they're left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
Abby, we lost you there at the very end. You were just concluding remarks about, and you just disappeared. So I don't know if you want to reconnect and join us again.
Please ask her to.
All right, well, he's on the phone. What does everyone think so far? I'm enjoying this. I think this is a good presentation. What does everyone else think?
Fantastic. It's marketing campaigns we need. The truth needs better marketing, better publicity.
It's strange how you tell a lie often enough, people believe it. But if you tell the truth often enough, do they ever believe it?
I think sometimes eventually they do. It has to become
Truth hurts.
much more socially accepted.
We make up our minds and then we don't listen to contravening facts, most people. You know, confirmation bias is a real thing, not just in us, but in politicians and every human being.
It was interesting to hear about how similar to the social media of today, the newspaper system was back then. And we also forget that there was a time, I don't know exactly the time frame for this, but it lasted pretty long, where you could literally send mail to people 2 or 3 times a day. Like it was almost like what we look at as email. It would be really hard to keep track of emails if they're going back and forth a couple of times a day. And yet they were literally getting pieces of paper delivered in the big cities. And this was necessary for businesses in many cases, but imagine how we think we're so unique with these challenges of today and how similar they are to what she's been describing. By the way, I found out from Abby that she lost internet connection. She's trying to reestablish it now. She wasn't quite at the end, so we can hope for a little more.
Okay, the update is that it turns out it wasn't just my computer that dropped things. Apparently our whole household did. So we are rebooting. I mean,
Okay,
this
well,
rarely happens, but it's not totally unusual.
okay. Well, if you want to say something, can everybody hear what she's saying from my phone? Yeah.
Yes.
So
And
you're
we
on
we're
speaker.
waiting for you to come back. We
We're
want
If she
waiting
just
for
do
you to come
audio
back,
over the
but
phone, she could even dial into the meeting perhaps, but if she could just do audio over the phone, Stuart, and you do the slides.
I think I
That
just
would still
lost her.
work.
So yeah, that's a good idea. I pushed the wrong button on the side of my phone. Boy, is this technology fascinating. So I do have a
Zoom
question.
is the lemonade of COVID.
Yeah, sorry, I lost you there. So someone suggested you could just call into our Zoom as well. Do you want me to send you that? Because unfortunately, it might take you a few minutes to get established again on what you're attempting to do. So let me just look that up. It's really unfortunate how I've
her visibility, I wouldn't be at all surprised if there weren't some of these anti-evolution, anti-humanism, etc. hackers who monitor what she's doing.
Yes, we're just seeing. Okay.
The problem with then versus now is that the opposition, the bad guys are winning because the good guys won't engage. I think. The climate scientists try to stand back and not get involved in the fights. True, Bill McKibben is an exception, maybe James Hansen an exception, but when we don't have a media that will cover us, how do we do it?
You need to put a bikini bathing suit on it.
The deniers are talking in a different place than the people who support these things. So you have to go to the same place. You have to find where they are and talk to them where they are.
And the opposition is doing a great job of dividing and conquering us. You know, make us fight over which is the biggest problem that we care about and ignore the systemic solutions and the possible solutions. Make us fight about abortion and identity politics and distract us from economic inequality and climate change. The inability to manage life on a finite planet at this rate of population. And
You know, there is a category of individual which I used to call the ineducables. And unfortunately they exist. When I was young, there was a big mystery about the missing link. Everybody was looking for the missing link between apes and humans. And that was the best argument that people who disbelieved evolution had, was that somehow the apes were too different from humans to explain the fact that we were highly intelligent and creative and inventors of planes and trains and whatever, and the apes were still picking bananas. And now there are now about 20 hominin species that have been discovered by paleontologists between, let's say, chimpanzees, our closest relative, and us, or between the earliest humans like Lucy and us, 20, at least 20.
don't forget the bonobos. Current bonobos.
Well, the chimpanzees have the closest DNA.
No,
to ours.
bonobos. Bonobos are closer than chimpanzees.
Bonobos and chimpanzees are equally close to humans because they split off as separate species after human beings split off from that common ancestor. The common ancestor between humans.
I'm sorry, that's incorrect.
Common ancestor for chimpanzees.
Well, I'm before we get into an argument about that, Abby is back. She has rejoined us. So if you're in if you are in speaker mode, and Abby, if you want to unmute, you can continue with your final slide or two.
Okay, so can everybody hear me now?
Yeah,
yes.
Welcome back.
Okay, great. So glad to be back. Now, where did I cut out? Had you gotten to the slide that says organize?
Yes, and you had started to summarize about what all of the, Darwin's Apostles sort of taught us. So you can go back a little maybe.
Okay, I will. Okay, so go back to the slide that says organize then.
Okay.
And I'll just take it from there. There we are. Okay. So as I said, there will be a little bit of repeat here, and then I'll get on to the next thing I'm going to say. So here we are today. Darwin's apostles are long dead. In our current era, fundamentalist religions, moneyed interests, and politicians who pander to them are breaking down our body politic. the idea that science matters, and even our concept of truth itself. This breakdown has taken place over many decades. To paraphrase Martin Niemöller, first they came for evolutionary biology, but I didn't speak out because I'm not an evolutionary biologist. Next, they came for climate science, but I didn't speak out because climate change is not quite enough of a disaster. Then they came for elections, and people finally started to pay attention. There are those who say that we are engaged in a struggle for the soul of this nation. I say that we are engaged in a struggle for the brain of this nation. But a brain without good values does not accomplish much that is decent. So we are engaged in a struggle for the brain and integrity of this nation. In the Victorian era, Darwin's Apostles banded together to assert and defend an unpopular scientific truth. Today's tenacious evolutionary biologists, climate scientists, and epidemiologists are asserting and defending unpopular scientific truths, and even the politically unpopular idea that truth even exists. They will need their apostles too. Last slide, please. Their apostles are us. And that's the end of the talk. So thank you. And thanks for sticking with me to the end there.
Well, thank you so much, Abby. That was great. People were saying positive things about your presentation so far while we missed
great.
for a moment. But thanks so much. And I take it that you've been giving this talk or something like it during the last couple of years since the book was published. Is that right?
Yes. I originally wrote this, and I see my co-author on the screen there, David Renstein. We did our rollout for this book on Darwin's birthday 2 years ago. And this is the talk that I gave then, although I've had to update it in light of the fact that we're having an epidemic and that Trump is no longer president and a few things like that. But it's actually kind of scary how much the whole, facts don't exist mindset has actually gotten worse since then rather than better.
Mm-hmm.
So it's still
And
remarkably topical.
Yeah.
And Trump's coming back.
Yeah.
Unless we do something very important, like put him in jail.
Yeah, well, and the point, he hasn't gone away just because he's an ex-president, as we have all noticed. And by the way, I've just got to say, it is great to see all of you. I'm seeing so many friends here. This is just so lovely. So even on Zoom, gosh, all these people I have not seen for a while. It's just wonderful.
Well, we're glad to be able to provide this kind of community, and we would love to have been able to get together in person. But does anyone who's here have any questions for Abby and about her knowledge?
I have a very small question, Abby, if you would, a very
Sure.
small question. And it's very small. It's not going off on the later part of your talk, but do you have any, it's often been said that part of Darwin's hesitancy had to do with the fact that he had a very religious and very cautious and frightened wife. Do you think that played a role in his, slowness in pushing his ideas, if we can, that's not even totally fair, but I just wondered to what extent Mrs. Darwin played a role there.
Oh, I would say that was probably the case because, well, she was terribly afraid of Darwin's being officially an atheist, because then she felt that they would not be able to meet in heaven. And that mattered a great deal to her. So that was probably part of it. But it was also a lot of other things. He had apparently sort of a very, bubbly and lively mind, but a very retiring personality. Not the kind of person who loved controversy. He lived very happily as sort of a respected citizen in the village where he lived, got along well with the local clergy. And you can kind of see how if he had a pleasant and comfortable life like that, he didn't want to upset relations with his neighbors and people who he, liked and got along with and were part of his everyday life. And it was going to be unpopular. As you saw, it was going to be unpopular with scientists as well. He was very convinced of what he had figured out. But this was why he kind of retired to the countryside and did endless research. He already had figured out he was right, but he wanted to make sure that he could prove it to everybody in every possible way. And this was somewhat more convenient than going out and confronting things. But as I said, he was a scientist at heart. And, as I kind of poked fun at a little bit during the talk, the one thing worse than publishing something controversial if you are a retiring scientist is having somebody scoop you. So that was why Wallace's letter really sent him into a tizzy, because he was also a very honorable man and he realized that Wallace should get credit for the discovery. But damn it, he didn't want to give up precedence because he had discovered it too. And that was what finally got him moving. And, and I'm sure that it was hard for him personally as well, though I gathered, he and his wife were very happy together.
Great. Jim Farmelant has a comment or question.
Yeah, I've read some people said about Darwin, but one reason that he had been reluctant to publish on evolution was because back in the 1840s, there was a lot of public discussion about evolution, mostly the Markian variety. Most of the people discussing it were either avowed atheists or socialists or other kinds of radicals. And Darwin did not want to become associated with have himself be associated with those kinds of people.
There was that, and there was also a book that was published that was actually very popular. I write about it in the book. I don't recall the title of the book anymore, but, something having to do with natural history, and it discussed all kinds of things. And it got people talking about evolution. And it is rumored that, Prince Albert read it to Queen Victoria and that she enjoyed it. But the problem there was that a lot of the other stuff in the book was pretty whiffy.
They can talk about things, yeah.
As I said, a lot of the rest of the book was not terribly scientific. So on the one hand, it got people talking about evolution, but on the other hand, it was not the most scientific of books. And I think that this too, Darwin didn't want to be associated with that, nor did the other serious scientists who corresponded with Darwin.
We have a comment or question from David and Lyndon.
Okay. David and Lyndon.
Yeah,
yes.
We're good with the big bright window.
Yes.
The microphone's well away. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes, I can.
Yeah. Did Wallace was he sort of an apostle of Darwin that promoted evolution after the publication of Origin of Species and after his own, or was he one of the people in the public sphere, or did you just bring him up because he sort of prodded Darwin to publish?
Oh no, he also promoted evolution in his own way. He was an interesting guy. Although his family was originally kind of, wealthy and establishment, they had slid a long way down, and he was not society's best friend. As I said, he had been radicalized by working in the country and seeing a lot of country poverty and the like. And he was just his own guy and did his own thing. And He did defend evolution in the public sphere quite a bit. As I said, these guys did different things. Huxley had his way of going about it. Wallace had his way of going about it. Hooker had his way of going about it. If you had taken a poll of them, Hooker probably is the one who would have said that he was the grown-up in the room. But they all did their own thing in their own way. David, what would you say about this? I'm talking to David, who co-wrote the book with me. Is David being allowed to unmute here?
Yeah, I mean, with Wallace, you got to remember that Wallace was about 10 years Darwin's junior. So there was sort of a mentor-pupil relationship between the two, which is one of the reasons why Wallace was even sending Darwin his specimens and that essay, that 20-page essay that basically said evolution. But post that, Wallace wrote in many scientific papers, publications, and in a lot of very popular publications about natural selection and evolution. But he always gave, out of respect, he always, and also, Darwin took the hits. In the 19th century, Darwin was the big target. He had the target on his back. So Wallace certainly benefited by being the co-author of the letter to the Linnaean Society. He's been benefited by being known as the co-discoverer of natural selection. But he did give a lot of very positive publicity to Origin of Species when it was published. And you got to remember, Darwin died in 1882. Wallace lived into the early 20th century. So that was another, when you have natural selection going through all of its iterations, and the discussion before about how, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes, just like in Darwin's time, there was a set of people with political, religious, and economic influence to essentially tamper with the truth. We have the same thing going through the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1950s. We know the Scopes monkey trial. We know Kitzmiller versus the Board of Education, which is late 20th century. And so we have, and we note this in the book, many, many times up until today. It's not like we can go, whoo, that's done, we're over with that. The reality is that we're still fighting this battle. Sadly, it now includes, as Abby well said, things like climate science and what is even truth. But Darwin's seminal work, because you can remember he wrote another 11 books. This work still touches a nerve because there are people who have an economic, a political, or religious reason to deny truth. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. I see some other comments and questions though. So Mike Hennar, would you like to share a thought?
Yeah, Abby, thank you for this talk and all the subtleties that I really never knew anything about. Very interesting. I kind of liked your approach where, you kept going with lessons learned. Mm-hmm. And that was really interesting. And while I thought some of the lessons learned were not universally true, they were situational, I like the approach. And then, piggybacking on what David just said, we don't seem to be making a lot of progress. We seem to be at a standstill at best. And I wonder if you have any lessons learned out of the lessons learned that might apply where we should be going in the future. to turn the tide?
Well, all I can say is it is so hard. I will go with persist, persist, persist. And to the extent that well, one of the strengths of the apostles was that each of them did what he could do. Huxley was good at showmanship. Others were good at other things. And, I think that's what we've got to do is get lots of people with talent out there doing the things that they are good at, whether it's social media, whether it's talks like this, whether it's politics, finding ways in that they can do. I know that there are some humanist societies that have a lot of legislative initiatives that they do. And the point is, each of us can do different things. One of the things that I do, which you could hear a little bit of maybe in this presentation, is I am one of those biologists who can actually do comedy, which means that I can reach wide audiences that way. And Pamela is giving me the thumbs up on that one. But that is a way of reaching people who, might tune out otherwise. It won't necessarily reach the unreachable, but as I said, it's another way in. But I'm actually going to say something, come to think of it, about reaching the unreachable, because this often comes up where people will say, well, it's all very well that, you're giving a talk at a humanist society like this, where people are prepped to listen to you and believe you, or at least listen to what you have to say, but you're never going to touch the real fundamentalists that way. Two things to say about that. First of all, in a different sense of the term, swing for the fences. The point is there are people on the fence who can be reached. And those are the people you're addressing, not the people who already agree with you. But I will say also, what I try to do is give the people who agree with me, who are not biologists, a few talking points that they can go away with. When I talk about unintelligent design, which is one of my routines, I give people 5 talking points that they can take out into the world. So it's a way of giving people on my side some equipment that they can use when they are talking to their cousins or neighbors or uncles or whatever. But the other thing that's really interesting, and I've learned this because I've been on this lecture circuit for over 10 years now, is, and I know David had this experience as well, because we were at the same meeting. It is remarkable the number of people who actually did leave fundamentalist religion, and they did it in part because of logical argumentation. I was invited to give a talk, my unintelligent design talk, at the American Atheists' big annual meeting. I think it was their 50th anniversary down in Austin, Texas. So you have to imagine these were not humanists. These were the hard-hitting, bad cop atheists who love that role. And, imagine a ballroom, a lecture hall with about 800 to 1,000 people in it, and somebody up on stage at one point asking, so who here originally left religion, at least in part because of logical argumentation? Raise your hand. Now, I'm one of the few people who actually comes from a long line of atheists, so I didn't raise my hand. But most of the room raised their hand. So these were all people who had been convinced through logical argumentation and evidence and all that. And I will tell you again, in my experience on the lecture circuit, I have had so many people come up to me and say, yes, I left religion. Thank you for doing this. I'm learning things. And I now count among my friends probably a good half dozen, not just former fundamentalists, but former fundamentalist ministers who are now big fans of mine. We are friends. So as I said, it can happen. So it's always worth trying.
Thanks so much, Abby, for that acknowledgement that you can work with logic, but you can also work with humor. And I think that having good humor in engaging with people is helpful, so that it doesn't just become a screaming match or you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. AG listed as Arlene Germain. Who is that? Ellery there? Who is that?
That's Ellery
Wow.
Shemp. Hey, Ellery, it's great to see you.
I didn't recognize you with your wonderful beard. It's great. So you have a comment and you're muted right now. So
You're muted right now, Ellery.
He's still muted. Oh, there we go.
Oh,
Hi,
here's Arlene. She's going to help out. Hi, Arlene. Good to see you.
Hi.
There we go.
There we go. Abby, I wanted to ask you about the role of Louis Agassiz. I have
my goodness,
admired him for his discovery or his championship of the idea of glaciers and glaciation, whatever, but he became a bit of a traitor to the idea of evolution. And he did a whole lot of harm, it seems to me, in preventing the idea of evolution to be more widespread in the United States in the 1800s.
Yeah, no, Agassiz is a really interesting and flawed character. He was the guy who pretty much originated the idea of ice ages.
Yes,
you know, he had studied glaciers in the Alps where they have glaciers, and then he felt that he saw evidence of glaciation, you know, here in North America, and you know, proposed the idea of ice ages. And that was really the first time it had been proposed, and it was a groundbreaking idea at the time. An idea, by the way, that Wallace took advantage of, because he realized that islands could be connected to the mainland if sea levels went down. But anyway, so yeah, he did wonderful work in geology. But boy, did he not like evolution. And he was at that point, you know, a powerful and established scientist. And he did the equivalent of the debates that Thomas Huxley did in England. Asa Gray debated Agassiz here in Boston, you know, at Harvard and places like that. But basically, they had numerous public debates where Asa Gray took the side of evolution and Agassiz took the side of naysayers. And, you know, he lost out badly. And in fact, as I recall, you know, Agassiz's star kind of, you know, declined after a while because he just could not get on board with evolution, even as the evidence mounted. And that's the thing about evolution. It's like the more you look, the more you try to refute it. If you are honest, if you are actually looking at evidence as such, the evidence kept mounting up for evolution, and he couldn't, you know, he would not admit to that. And it's my understanding that kind of late in life, his friends actually got together and bought him passage to the Galapagos.
That's great.
Yeah. But yeah, it's very sad because, you know, Agassiz had a lot to offer, but he definitely missed the boat on evolution.
Well, and his influence was pervasive in many other areas. He linked up with the anti-Pasteur people who opposed vaccination. We've heard about this recently. And the idea that it was God that caused disease and not little germs that you couldn't even see. And Agassiz got linked up with that idea.
Yeah, so there's a bunch of things he didn't do as well as he could have. And for a biologist, I mean, that's pretty bad. I mean, rejecting evolution and the germ theory of disease, I mean, that is not a good track record.
Nice to hear you, Abby.
It's great seeing you, Ellery. Yeah, it's wonderful.
He was batting .333.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things I took away, Abby, is the importance of the peer review idea, the idea that scientists communicating honestly with each other and learning from each other and acknowledging each other is how progress is made in science, not just the individual geniuses who might have, like Agassiz, horrific mistakes in their thinking, let's say, or their their conclusions or maybe biases that can be eliminated the more you include into conversation. So I thought that was really helpful. I want to go ahead, Jane and Lynn. I'm waiting to get back to you, David and Lyndon as well, but Jane, who is actually frozen right now.
My comments sort of sent to yours. Okay.
Go ahead, you're here.
My question at this point is, have you given any thought to the fact that what Dan Dennett called Darwin's dangerous idea is sort of one idea, and it had to make its way in the United States against a fairly long tradition of anti-intellectual or anti-elite? Do you have any comments about the interplay there?
I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Could you clarify a little bit?
Well, there's a very strong anti-intellectual thread in American life,
Right.
And
right.
so the fact that, you know, the elite are coming up with this new idea, you know what I mean, makes it's fighting against a river that's already running almost, you know what I mean? So when you get these fundamentalists and what have you, they're not just arguing the hardline creation model or whatever, but they've also already decided that they don't like people with educations and they don't like elites, however they describe them. Do you know what I mean?
Well,
so multiple intersections in society here.
Oh, there are multiple intersections there, although I always bridle at the idea that somehow scientists or educated people are the only elites out there, considering how many scientists actually come from not very distinguished or wealthy families. There are a lot of other elites out there who are very wealthy and very powerful and very anti-intellectual. Certain former presidents spring to mind. And so the idea that there is one elite who happen to be some educated scientists and that all these other billionaires who happen to be fundamentalists are therefore common people and not elite, despite the fact that they can buy entire state legislatures to do their bidding, I think is, let's just say all of those very wealthy conservatives are casting themselves in the role of the underdog and the downtrodden little man, and they are anything but. It's a good bit of play acting, but it has nothing to do with reality.
David has a point.
Yeah, and there's also the fact that there's always often in the history of the United States been a clergy elite that is given enormous leeway and tax exempt status, by the way, to say what they think. David and Lyndon.
And I would say large microphones. I mean, presidents will hand microphones over to clergy.
And ministerial tax deductions.
Right.
Exactly.
Now it
David
looks
and
like
Lyndon.
David really wants to say something here.
Yeah, go ahead. Let David say. I'll do my question after David.
Oh, I'm sorry. I mean, I don't want to bump the line here. But you know, I take your point. But we have to also remember that there are so many people who are just regular folks who accept evolution. Even in the 19th century, you know, our book is about 5 people, but there were hundreds of people, both in and outside of academia, in and outside of the clergy, in and outside of all walks of life, who were pro-Darwinian evolutionists, which really helped to push Darwin's theory, not just in areas that you would consider quote unquote elite, like let's say educated places. I mean, Robert Ingersoll, who was, you know, the great orator, humanist orator of the 19th century, would go around the country and he had a tremendous following. He would often write about and speak about Darwin to the masses, to the people working in the coal mines. And so it wasn't like, oh, you had to be really scientifically literate to understand Darwin's work. Even if you didn't read Darwin's work, you could get it second and third hand. There used to be a newspaper, in fact, it's still published, called The Truth Seeker. which was had a huge distribution across the United States. And it was a free thought newspaper that would serialize Darwin's work, both The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man, for lay people. And people gobbled this stuff up.
Yeah,
So it's important to remember while we're in this battle that we are, as Abby said very well, that we are in this battle not by ourselves, that we are citizen activists when we talk about truth and we talk about Darwin, we talk about these. So I'll stop there.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and I'll add to that in the late 1800s and early 1900s, just speaking of Ingersoll and newspapers and the like, there was also a lot of sort of intellectual hunger then as well.
Mm-hmm.
Most little towns had a lyceum where
Mm-hmm.
there would be lecture series. There were the famous Chautauquas, sort of, traveling intellectual road shows and the like. And it's like, yeah, there were a lot of tent revival meetings, but there were a lot of Chautauquas too.
Right.
So, there was a lot of everything. It's the US. It's a messy place.
David and Lyndon, what did you?
Yeah, I have a comment and a question. First comment is, if anyone's interested, there is a play in Worcester right now called An Act of God. It's a satirical play where God introduces 10 new commandments. It's written by the David Yaverbaum, who does the Tweet of God on Twitter.
Oh, I'm loving it. Huh.
I'll post the link to that in the chat. It's running this weekend and next weekend. Second, a question for Abby Hafer. John Delancey said he was working on a video series with you called, I think it was called God's Goofs.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a bit?
Oh, I wish I could say more. Yeah, this is something where John Delancey and I have been fans of each other for quite a while, and we have been trying to bring to fruition this idea of animated cartoons for, let's say maybe 10-year-olds or so on that would just illustrate some evolutionary principles in a very accessible way. The problem is it's hard to do and it's hard to get money, and people who do animations work for money. So, we don't quite know where this is going to go. We keep trying, but, we keep running up against roadblocks. So, I hope we can make it go. But I don't know if we'll be able to or not. I wish we could. Sorry to not give you a better progress report.
Thanks, David. I will check in with John if I see him. I'm going on a Star Trek cruise in 2 weeks.
Oh my goodness!
And he's always there. He's a fun guy,
right?
As well as being an awardee of the AHA, and as you know, very active in his arts work. Sheldon actually chatted in a question. I can't exactly understand the question, but it's regarding the fact that Texas being in control of so much of the publication industry for education of public schools. He wonders, has anti-evolution or more religious attitudes, whether they're winning out in the educational curriculum, to your understanding?
Okay,
And
I
feel free to
actually
jump in, Sheldon, if I misstated that.
Okay, I do understand the question. This is something that probably some people in the audience know about, but not everybody. Is that because Texas orders textbooks by the whole state, it means that what the Texas Board of Education wants is what pushes the publishing industry, the textbook industry, because Texas is this one huge single buyer. And therefore, textbooks will be written with the sensibilities of the Texas Board of Education in mind. And so, the saying is that as Texas goes, so goes the nation when it comes to textbooks. And this has been an ongoing problem. It has the potential to be a lot less of a problem now because publishing is not really done with lead type anymore. So the potential exists to have textbooks, and I see this a lot of the time in my teaching work, where you can actually modify a textbook, where some, big company, McGraw-Hill or something like that, will come out with their textbook, but they can actually have modified editions, or you can even just take their big edition and say, I want chapters 4, 6, 10, 11, 17, and 19, and you make your own textbook that way. So I would say it has the potential to not be as bad as it was, because, as I said, it's no longer a case that type is set and there's one edition that everybody has to buy. It's a little bit different now. I don't know how much that has come to fruition in terms of textbooks for school kids, but it's definitely more of a possibility now.
Right. And Jim Farmelant has a comment or question.
You're muted.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
I was following up on what you were saying before about popular discussion on Darwin. In Europe, the workers' movement, the various socialist parties and groups did a lot of work promoting educating workers on Darwin's ideas. For example, the German Social Democrats have published a pamphlet, I think it was called like Moses versus Darwin, which is like one of the most, probably was their best-selling publication at the time. It outsold anything written by Marx or Engels. And it showed there was a great hunger among German workers to learn about Darwin.
Well, there's two other interesting things about this. One is that at the time, evolution was revolutionary, not just in scientific terms, but because it did say that all humans had the same ancestry, the same background, that there was nothing particularly special about royalty or aristocracy, that whites and blacks and browns and so on all had the same origins and the like. And that was very radical for the time. And the other thing is, you were just talking about the German workers, and I hadn't been aware of that. I'm not surprised, but it's interesting. But this is also what Huxley did. Huxley did what he called working men's lectures. He was another case of someone whose family was middle class-ish, but had become very poor. And so, he studied medicine because education was important, but also because it was a way of making a living. And you could kind of almost apprentice as a doctor and slowly learn the profession that way, which was part of what he did. He also went to medical school, but not Oxford or Cambridge, but what he felt was a real medical school where you actually cut things up as opposed to learning Greek and Latin. And so he made a point, as I said, of giving what were called the working men's lectures, which really were open to anybody and were specifically targeted at working men. And he was very, very proud of what he was able to accomplish there.
Great, thanks. You've given us a lot to think about and a lot of great ideas. I urge everyone to check out this book that Abby and David wrote. And also urge you to look at the chat, where a lot of people have shared interesting links and suggestions for further research. I wanted to mention myself that I heard on NPR earlier this week that a woman comedian from Newton, Massachusetts, right here, has become huge on TikTok. And her name is Abby Richards, and she's a climate-oriented debunker, I guess, and she works to entertain while debunking disinformation. And so meant to be incredibly hilarious and funny. So look up Abby Richards and maybe on TikTok. And I will also say that it reminds me of the way that objective reality is making a comeback in terms of just making fun of the stupidity of denying it in organizations that are more ironic, like Birds Aren't Real, if you've ever heard of
yes.
that. An organization that purports to believe that birds actually all died out and the government has replaced them with surveillance devices that fly around spying on us, because that's the kind of crazy that we're seeing these days. But I think getting back to science is something that we humanists are willing and able to engage in, and hopefully we will continue to organize. So thanks so much, Abby, and everyone.
Yay.
Thank her. And
I found, by the way, on the thing about the crazy conspiracy theories, I have friends that really believe McDonald's serves roadkill hamburger meat.
Oh, I hadn't heard that one.
Oh man, is that they don't think about what the economic consequences would be if that were true. How would the government budget the incredible expense it would be to replace birds with in all the videos and all of the, yards? I mean, we wouldn't waste the money on that. It couldn't be true economically.
Well, I think that's the whole point.
That's the beauty of Birds Aren't Real, is that it's meant to be satire. It's this silly idea, sort of saying, but they're doing it. They're doing it with a stone face. They're basically saying, yes, we really believe that birds aren't real. Here's our evidence, yada. But it's all satire.
Like the flying spaghetti monster.
Like the flying, yes, exactly.
Which is a great church. I belong to that one.
Absolutely, yes.
For those of you who are still around, I would like to do a quick survey. How many of you would feel comfortable having a live meeting, if you live in the Boston area, that is, and can come in late March? Do you feel that that's safe enough at this point? Feel free to either give a thumbs up with your device or raise your hand and wave. I'm looking at everybody right now. Good. I feel like a lot of you.
Would it be a hybrid? Because I don't want to give up Zoom. I want to add in person.
We would do our best. Even doing Zoom sometimes has technical challenges, as we've seen. To do that in the middle of a lecture that's live might be challenging, but we can try. Have you talked about doing that with the Concord Humanists? You who are here from that group, hybrid events? I mean,
we're not trying to do hybrid, but if we ever did, we would.
Yeah.
I mean, we're not trying to do in person.
Yeah. We'd like to get together again, because as you see, a lot of us are here and haven't seen each other in person in a long time. So
but there's no reason it has to be these meetings. It could be a different meeting, like a party.
Yes, exactly. We have an Equinox luncheon that we're going to try to pull off, whether it's going to be at a restaurant or in our Harvard space that we can bring food into. I hope that you will all stay in touch through our website, which is bostonhumanists.org. And again, feel free to copy the chat. There's a save chat button at the bottom of the chat. For those of you who aren't familiar with that, it makes it very easy to just dump it in your computer, and then you can come back later. And because once this ends, that will all disappear. And once this meeting ends. So thank you all very much for being here. Oh yeah, here we go. Stop recording.